Hi, I'm Linda Mal, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Dallas Museum of Art, and our interviewer, Aimee Cardoso, speaks with curator Dr. Nicole Myers about the exhibition Art and Nature in the Middle Ages. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, I'm Aimee Cardoso for Art This Week, and we're here at the Dallas Museum of Art with Dr. Nicole Myers to talk about the exhibition Art and Nature. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for coming.
So this exhibition is in collaboration with the Musée de Cluny. Can you tell us about the museum and where a lot of these works are coming from?
So the Cluny Museum is one of the world's renowned museums of medieval European art. It started in the 19th century, and maybe not surprisingly because they're based in Paris, a bulk of their collection started with artwork coming from French cathedrals, for example, or French collections, but their collection represents medieval art across all of Europe, from west to the east, and even includes holdings, I believe, of Islamic art from the Middle East. So it has just built upon this legacy and this collection, as I mentioned, is one of the world's premier sites for this kind of art.
In this exhibition, you're exploring depictions of nature in the Middle Ages. What was their view of nature, and how might that differ from what we consider, nature today?
The view of nature shifts across time. So one of the things that I like to point out with this exhibition is that we're covering more than 500 years of European art history. And so the themes that we're exploring in the exhibition, of course, are depiction of plants and animals across a multitude of Western European countries. And the theme or the focus of the artisans will often shift between symbolism, realism, between stylization, for example, or sort of a radical simplification of forms, to pure decoration. So these are all motifs that come out through the 5 thematic sections of the exhibition. So the first section of the exhibition looks at stylization, which is really the aesthetics of what are the kinds of continuities with classical antiquity, for example, where are the breaks that we're finding with the origins of medieval art. And our exhibition starts in the Romanesque period. I think the earliest piece is about 10th century, and we'll take you through the 5th section to the early 16th century. So we're really on the steps of the Renaissance. The second thematic section of the exhibition is looking at symbolism in Christian art. So they're objects that were either used in the Christian liturgy or that held Christian symbolism. The third section of the exhibition is small, but it packs a powerful punch, and it's looking at Gothic decor and how nature played into the decoration of Gothic cathedrals and that great boom of architecture that started in sort of Paris in the mid-12th century, but would sort of continue and radiate outwards after that. Section 4 we're standing in right now, and it's looking at plants and animals and how they're depicted in everyday life, so that we get 13th century forward, a move towards showing nature not just in religious art, either made for the church or symbolism, but works of art that have secular themes that were made for the very wealthy, the aristocrats, princely families, and how there was this impulse to bring nature inside. And the 5th and final thematic section of the exhibition is looking at the depiction of landscape. And this is part of this evolution of style where we start in the Romanesque, where there's a great desire to simplify forms for great symbolic impact. But they're not trying to show a naturalistic representation of the world through illusionism. But you'll get that with sort of the development of the early Renaissance in Italy. It'll spread north, and by the time you get to sort of northern countries in Europe in 15th century, early 16th century, all of a sudden you're seeing a much more illusionistic depiction of the natural world around, and using all kinds of pictorial devices, whether in tapestries or stained glass or illuminated manuscripts, to give a sense of recession, spatial recession, atmospheric recession, and a greater desire to situate man and woman within nature as opposed to fragmenting it or perhaps depicting a flower or a tree to symbolize nature. And now we're suddenly getting more pictorial depictions of a landscape.
You mentioned kind of this Christian iconography that becomes really prevalent. In medieval thought, I mentioned in the catalog that it commonly kind of stands for the hand of God. How was this brought into the church?
There's typically no depiction of plants and animals that didn't come with some type of larger symbolism. It's true that sometimes they have a purely ornamental function, but they often don't lose a symbolic meaning that was inherited through classical antiquity, that was coming from Asian, from East Asian influences like Islamic art, but getting sort of retold through Christian storytelling in the medieval period. So when we get to Gothic cathedrals, it's kind of this interesting moment where there's a bit of a shift away from the stylization that had defined the Romanesque period, still wanting to bring nature indoors, but we get not just depiction of plants that might have symbolic content, but we can suddenly identify them, where we can say these are maple leaves or these are sweetbriar roses, but they're usually not entirely divorced from symbolic function either, so that when you see sweetbriar roses, they also were a Marian symbol. They represent the Virgin Mary. So you get this kind of great mixture of impulses that are coming in, on the one hand, just this great joy and celebration of nature, and kind of a reveling in this naturalism that we see that appears and becomes more mainstream by the middle of the 13th century. But as I mentioned, when you're looking at the capitals, for example, or in the stained glass, you can still often connect it to a greater symbolic meaning that ties into Christian iconography.
So talking about the animals, I read a lot about how there are these ideas of these fantastical beasts, but how, like unicorns and dragons and griffins. What did these creatures mean to a person living at this time? Were they thought of as real, or were they primarily just symbols?
They were thought to exist, and I like to stress the part where medieval Europeans were highly aware that there were not unicorns or griffins in their backyard or across the street, but they were still thought to exist, and there was this great fluidity between real and imagined during the time period. And so these mythical beasts were thought really to exist outside of the borders of Christianity, and more specifically the Middle East or points further east. So when we see them in the artwork in this exhibition, it's usually in a religious context, and through the Christian bestiary, which was in the Middle Ages, sort of a book of knowledge of behavior and traits of animals, but again reinterpreted through a Christian lens, they often take on very pointed symbolic meaning. So when we find them on religious objects or reliquaries like we have in the exhibition, and you see dragons, for example, they can be a symbol, and usually only one meaning, of sin. They tend to represent evil, and when you find them on the context of a Christian object made for the church, it's really something to be vanquished through Christian faith, so that we find them often very playful, often not very frightening to us, I think, looking at today, and with great artistry, but it's never there just as decoration when we find them on these religious objects. It's typically, again, within the context of something to be triumphed over through faith.
Right. So you touched on earlier about some of the influences of other cultures. Specifically the ceramics, I wanted to talk about the Hispano-Moresque design work that you can find, especially in that one spice jar that's in this exhibition. Can you talk about kind of how that came to be and what the artists were, how did they alter their styles?
Yeah, one of the things that I hope comes through in this exhibition is the idea that the Middle Ages were anything but a dark period, the way that it's often said to be.
Well, that's the writers were, saying it was, but more or less it wasn't.
Yeah, no, it really wasn't. And some of the great innovations that we find in the artwork of the time is their ability to sort of mix and match from different cultural influences that were coming to them, both from the past, such as classical antiquity, but also from contemporary artisans that were working around the world. And one of these that we explore in the exhibition is the influence of Islamic art. And we have great Islamic civilizations that were established in southern Europe starting in the 8th century and moving forward. And you get them in southern Spain, you get them in southern Italy, and also in Sicily. And through these establishments of these Muslim communities, you get great ceramic workshops, specifically in Spain around Valencia. And as these different territories were reconquered by Christian European kings, these artisans stayed. And so on the one hand, through these different communities, you get the circulation of Islamic art and faience lusterware, like the example that we have from the Cure collection here in the exhibition, to kind of make that visual comparison, was greatly cherished. It was really the height of ceramic production in the Middle Ages around the world, and it was something that European collectors were really excited to see. And when these Muslim communities were sort of retaken over by these European territories, the artisans stayed, and they realized that they had an audience that greatly admired this kind of artwork, and there was a real appreciation for it. So these ceramic workshops would continue to produce, but like you see with the apothecary or the spice pot here, was made for a European audience, so that you don't get a lot of the sort of beautiful Islamic inscriptions anymore. Instead, you get a reappropriation of some of the motifs, like the tree of life, and a real joy and celebration of the beautiful decorative quality of these particular ceramics, but again, sent around Europe for a European audience. So we also have a plate that's in the exhibition with a beautiful Bryony pattern on it, also that same sort of high quality luster faience ware, so that we get this combination of technique and sometimes even the form of the ceramics, but made for a Christian European audience.
Right. So it's abstracted kind of
Yeah.
Arabic symbols almost, I feel like.
And really, yeah, it is. And you
Yeah.
see that in the spice pot where they're loving the arabesques, and it tied into really the aesthetic that was being developed in the Romanesque period. They were looking, in addition to looking at Islamic art, they were looking at Celtic art and sort of art from the Germanic tribes that existed in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. So they had a real appreciation of what we would consider today more abstract decor that you see through the ronceau and the scrolling vines, for example. And I think it's not difficult to see when we look at these examples what it was they were responding to in Islamic art. And I think, again, the great triumph is the fact that these have survived. When you think about how fragile ceramics are, that these were highly prized items. And in the case of the spice jar that we have, I love the fact, too, that what you would have put in this vessel, the use of the vessel, was probably sort of medicines and spices coming from the Middle East. So again,
Right.
there's this desire to tailor the art object in terms of the decor, but also how it was being used by the European audience.
Ties it all together.
Yeah.
We want to thank Dr. Myers for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to dma.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.